that tonight's gonna be a good night, that tonight's gonna be a good, good night. I feel it. That tonight's gonna be a good night, that tonight's gonna be a good night, that tonight's gonna be.
Have you ever had a moment when you just know with complete certainty? Microphone. Are we live? Can you hear me? Okay. I'll start again. Have you ever had a moment when you knew with complete certainty and with blinding clarity what was going to happen next? I'm sure you have. It all happens to all of us. And when that future arrives, it's not really a surprise because, in a sense, you've already experienced it. It's a kind of future gazing. I'm not talking about looking into the entrails of a chicken or counting the leaves at the bottom of your teacup, but for me, it's all about cold, hard logic. When I first met with Doug and Orion, I had a conversation with them and I said, we should work together because I can see a future. And I saw it, even then, 8 years ago, when Zinzino would become a leading life science company. So where we are now doesn't surprise me at all. But I want to explain to you that I can see further into the future. Again, based on logic, based on current economic and political trends. And I know where we're going. I really do know exactly where we're going. In the very near future, you're all going to see this, and I may even be still alive to see it too. Zinzino is going to be one of the most influential companies in the whole sector of healthcare worldwide. Now that might sound... Look, I know people tell you this kind of stuff all the time, but I'm being serious. I want to talk about medeconomics, the dismal science of economics. So you might think that's not very interesting. You might be surprised. Let me show you some pictures. We have reached the end of the road of the healthcare systems that operate today. They are reactive healthcare systems. What that means is we wait until people get sick and then we try to treat them. We don't do that great a job. Most modern medicines are good at treating the symptoms of diseases, but as you know very well, they're not curative. They're the wrong set of tools. And we've been quite successful in developing that kind of healthcare for about a generation or so, since the 1950s, I guess you could say. But we've run out of road. We have reached the end of the road. And the reason why we've reached the end of the road, and the reason why the healthcare system in its current shape is dead, even although many of the people who operate within it don't know that, is because of a law called Stein's Law. Now, if any of you are economists, you might have heard of this. Herbert Stein was a 20th century American economist and one of the few economists who was influential enough to have a law named after him. And what Stein's Law says is, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Pretty profound, huh? I mean, you could probably come up with a better law than that. But it's true. It's true. If something cannot continue, it must inevitably come to an end. Now, what Herb Stein was talking about, he was really talking about economics, but of course, medeconomics is just a branch of economics, and healthcare is contained within these principles. If the current model of healthcare cannot go on, it will and it must stop. Basic economics, and as such, the healthcare system, just like any other complex system, is subject to the laws of supply and cost and demand. Very, very simple. So how does this work out in terms of healthcare? Well, I think what you need to know is what's going on in pharmaceutical terms, in hospital terms, and in demographic terms. It sounds a little dry, but bear with me. We've seen a kind of a shift from small molecules in terms of pharmaceuticals to what are called biological molecules. These have the promise of being more precise, giving you a larger therapeutic index, more beneficial effects, hopefully less damaging effects. Biologicals are expensive. To create them, it's a very complex process, And that's reflected in the types of prices that are charged for these products. Now, these are North American prices, but prices around the rest of the world are not so different. So the average cost of these types of molecules is somewhere between 10 and, as you can see here, $500,000 a year, or the equivalent in whatever currency you're working in. Who on earth can afford that? How many individuals can afford these healthcare costs? How many states can afford these healthcare costs? Getting sick in the United States, in fact in North America, is the single most common cause of bankruptcy and becoming homeless. It's a dangerous place to become sick in. And of course, the American culture creates sickness like no other. But we're not that different. Let me give you an example of just one biological molecule. This is a drug that's used to treat spinal muscular atrophy. It's not a perfect drug. It's given to young children, very new babies, and it's actually killed a few of them through acute liver damage. Not a perfect drug at all, but look at the costs. This is something that costs $2.1 million for a single injection. Who can afford that? Of course, if it's your baby, you'll mortgage your house. You'll do whatever you can to help your child. But this is not tenable. This is something that cannot continue. And if it cannot continue, it must stop. And the reason why the situation is worse than just $2.1 million for an injection is the pattern, the trend of current public health, which is extremely negative. If it was only a limited number of people who needed these drugs, we could afford it. Maybe not individually, but communally, we could make a decision to afford it. But look at what's happening in the real world. This is from the Rand Corporation. And what it shows is the way in which the numbers of people with chronic illnesses have increased from 1995 to 2020, really a generation. And we've seen an increase in the numbers of people with chronic degenerative disease. It's approximately half. And on all current projections, it's going to continue to increase. Actually, I think that's conservative. It looks as if the rate is speeding up. So the numbers of people needing these incredibly expensive medications is increasing. And people are getting sicker, younger, so they're needing them for longer periods of time. This is just one condition. It used to be known as non-alcohol related fatty liver disease. It has a different name now, but I'll just use the old terminology because it's the one that most people are familiar with. You can see here that back in 1990, it was known to affect 1 in 5 of the world's population. So that's already a huge burden. And it's not a serious condition in itself, but if it's not treated, if you don't change your lifestyle, you're going to go on to develop much more serious conditions, a significant number of which are fatal. So look at the trends. You can see that now in 2020, it's affecting about 40%, and by 2030, it's going to affect almost half the world's population. Just this one condition on its own will overwhelm the healthcare services of every country in the world. This is just one condition, and I could show you 20 others, which all show the same trend. If something cannot continue, it will stop. Let me give you a snapshot of what and how this has been developing in the United States. So these are based on national health surveys. Their data is not perfect, but it's the best that we have. And you can see here that in terms of people who present with a single chronic disease, the numbers have increased between 2000 and 2020. This is a very short period of time. I mean, it's less than a single generation, by about a third. Something is going very seriously wrong. And we're not just seeing, as I said, more and more of these conditions. They're emerging in younger and younger patients. And so we're seeing all of these chronic degenerative conditions emerging in young children, teenagers and adolescents, who a generation ago, or when I was a teenager or an adolescent, we didn't see this. We really didn't see children with eczema and migraines and hypertension and fatty liver disease. You didn't see that. It didn't exist. So here's another snapshot of the same trend. Now we're talking about individuals who have more than one chronic degenerative disease. This is looking at it over a shorter time period, but the rate of increase is pretty much the same. So let's go back further in time and look at the very first national health survey that was ever conducted in the United States, which was conducted back in 1935. Now, how many people do you think were sick back then? 1 in 10, 10%. So for a doctor who's just treating patients today and doesn't really know their history, they don't know how much better things used to be. You know, we tell ourselves as medical professionals that our science is getting more sophisticated. We're able to deliver to you better health care. No, not true. Because the population is getting sicker and sicker and sicker. Back in the day, only 1 person in 10 had these chronic degenerative diseases. Now they're affecting everybody. Is it because we're getting older as a population? That's a myth that you very often hear. Absolutely not. Let's take the period from 1980 to 1990. And the reason why I picked that period, because that's the period when life expectancy increased most rapidly, by approximately 2 or 3%, depending on how you calculate it. What actually happened in the background? In that same time period, all of these chronic degenerative diseases increased by between 40 and 150%. So clearly it's not because we're getting older. We're being poisoned, and you've heard me talk about this before. So more and more people are getting sick. More and more people are getting sick at an earlier age, requiring more medications, which are getting more and more expensive. And if you think that's bad enough, just wait. It's getting much, much worse because of basic demographics. Demographics are a problem because the numbers of people who are in the workforce, the productive section of the community, the people who are earning revenue, the revenue which is then used to spend on healthcare, proportionately are getting less. So you can see here that graph, the line that runs along the bottom, those are young people who have not yet entered the workforce, and the graph right up at the top is people of working age. But look at the graph that starts at the bottom and then starts to climb. That's elderly, 65 plus, and those are people who are leaving the workforce. And like me, they're becoming useless, unproductive consumers. We're not generating revenue. Well, I'm generalizing. I like to think I'm still a little productive. So the numbers of people who are working as a proportion of the total numbers in society are becoming less. They're required to shoulder an increasingly large burden of increasingly large amounts of healthcare spending. What cannot continue will stop. And it kind of gets worse than that, because when you break it down and look at the numbers of people who are moving into this plus 65 age group, yeah, we're seeing people dying off at the top end, of course, but we're seeing more and more people, because of prior demographic trends, entering this older age group. And the group that's increasing fastest at this moment are over 65s with multiple chronic degenerative diseases who have really extensive and therefore very expensive healthcare costs. What cannot continue must stop. We're at the point now where spending on these conditions is already overwhelming healthcare budgets, and in fact national budgets. Chronic diseases are now the leading causes of death and disability in all the developed nations, and it's starting to look that same way in China and in India and all other countries where Western food habits have been imported. So this is not just affecting us, this is very definitely a global problem. So these conditions are now reckoned to account for the vast majority of all deaths that are occurring today, accounting for 19.6% of the United States GDP. Now, the United States is actually bankrupt. I don't know if you know this. The idea that the United States can continue to spend 19.6% of its GDP looking after its increasingly sickly population is preposterous. You cannot go on like that. What cannot continue must and will stop. And we're seeing this trend emerging in younger patients, not only in the United States, that was where the trend first starts to appear, but it's global. It's happening everywhere. And because people are so sick and they're getting sick at younger ages, life expectancy is falling. All the gains that we've seen in terms of increased life expectancy over the last 50 or 60 years, they're being wiped out. And they're being wiped out incredibly rapidly. First, we saw that trend emerging in the United States, where they have a very unhealthy lifestyle. Then we started to see it emerging in the United Kingdom, which you can think of as the 51st state. We're very influenced by American cultural influences. And now we're seeing it elsewhere. We're seeing it happening in vulnerable groups in countries all over the world. We're going backwards. We're going backwards alarmingly rapidly. And you have to ask yourself, why is everything so terrible? Why is everything getting worse? And when did it start getting so bad? Well, 1950 is like an inflection point. That's when things really started to change. So this graph is a little complicated. Let me quickly explain it. The top two lines, the solid lines, what they show are deaths that are caused by infectious diseases. This is in terms of the respiratory system, but it's a general picture. It's valid for other systems as well. And you can see here that deaths caused by infections, respiratory tract infections, have been decreasing since 1940, and they continue to decrease over the time course of this slide. Now, what this slide doesn't show you is the deaths from infection had been falling since about 1900. And the most important cause of this reduction is nothing to do with medicine at all. We like to take the credit, but the reality is it was enabled by civil engineers who created sanitation schemes, gave us clean water, for example. One of the great heroes of medicine is a guy called Peter Bazalgette. He's the person who designed the water and sewage schemes that made London water safe to drink. He made the greatest impact on London's public health, and his work was then subsequently developed in many other countries worldwide. We know about Pasteur, and we know about Koch and some of the other famous medical personalities whose work eventually gave us the antibiotics or the vaccination programs that we put so much faith in. Well, we used to until COVID. But their impact has been very, very small. Their impact was relatively small. But look what's happening to the bottom lines, the dotted lines. What they're showing you are the numbers of people who died from non-infectious diseases, from chronic degenerative diseases. So in this case, COPD, lung cancer, and things like that. And you can see that between 1940 and 1950, maybe a little bit of an incline, but after 1950, that's when those deaths really start to take off and became the dominant causes of illness and death that they still are today. So what happened in 1950? Something really bad must have happened in 1950. Well, now, when you think about it, it couldn't have happened in 1950. Because if it had happened in 1950 and suddenly public health started to change, someone would have looked at the picture and said, hey, we've gone wrong here. What have we just done? And it would have been easy to work out what had gone wrong. No, you have to go back a little further in time. You have to find something that happened prior to that and then started to create a subtle toxicity that starts to show through maybe 10 or 15 years later. So what happened in 1940? That's when the introduction of the fast foods and the processed foods start to dominate, to the point where in North America they now account for 75% of all calories ingested. And in Britain it's a little less, it's about 65%. And actually, the figures are pretty bad everywhere else you look because of the marketing success of the multinational food companies, whose grotesquely unethical marketing of these toxic foods to our children is now causing mental and physical stunting to appear for the first time in 140 years. That's how bad things are. It is a really terrible and immoral situation. Ill health is being etched into our children, and it will affect them for the rest of their lives. I don't care what you eat, what you do to yourselves. You're adults and you can make your own decisions, but we really should be paying more attention to our children. What kind of an environment have we created for them? Let me give you a quick run-through of some of the ways in which our public health is changing. So these conditions are increasing, and I've just put them there in alphabetical order just to show you kind of a 30,000-foot view of the picture here. So all these diseases are increasing in frequency, occurring in younger and younger groups. But wait, I'm not finished. This only goes from A to E. Here's a few more. Now we're going from E to L. And here's a few more. Yeah. And this list is not complete. All of these conditions are increasing. And they're all appearing in younger and younger groups of patients, apart, of course, from the neurodevelopmental diseases. Luckily, some things are decreasing. And unfortunately, these are the things you don't want to decrease, right? And along with life expectancy. So let's take a look at the United States, which is like a guinea pig because they have embraced this terrible new diet more than anybody else. And you can see here that that's the dark blue trace. In 1950, in terms of life expectancy in the international league tables, they were at position number 13, I think, no, 11, hard to say, I think 13. And look, they're now 53. Actually, that was 2020. In the last couple of years, they've fallen 2 more places. Pharmaceutical medicine, reactive medicine, is not the answer. It is absolutely not the answer. And we know this, again, with complete conviction, because the last and most recent attempt of what we call Pasteurian medicine has been using something called polygenic risk scoring. And what that means is you look at a person's genetic code and you see if you can identify particular SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, associated with the risk. And then you look at all of the SNPs that this person has, you sum them all up, and you create what is known as a polygenic risk scoring. And the hope is that this will help you to identify those individuals who are more at risk. And if you could tell who they were, then perhaps you could treat them preventatively. And it turns out that it doesn't work. This is the best that Pasteurian reactive science can do. And it's just failed repeatedly. 3 major studies, all of them have failed. We cannot predict who's going to go and get sick, because it turns out it's very little to do with your genes. It is everything to do with your lifestyle. Not only that, I feel I'm losing you. Is this too technical? Good. So it turns out, and it's not just me, but it's cold-blooded medical economists who've done the math, and they said, it's not worth doing this. We can't afford it. It's not cost-effective. And even if we did have a system that could identify who's going to become sick, the drugs that we have to protect you are too toxic. We can't use them preventatively. This is the end of the reactive healthcare model. So let's come back to Stein's law, Herbert Stein. You have here increasing chronic disease of all those different varieties that I showed you. People are getting sick younger. Healthcare is getting more expensive. Doctors are overwhelmed with something that I call diagnostic paranoia. We live in an age of diagnostic chaos, because thanks to the really interesting and excellent science of people like Thomas Gunderson, bless Thomas, I love working with him, but we're developing more and more ways to analyze what's going on inside you. And we present these tests to the doctors, and doctors who are working defensively, if you don't use a certain test and a patient dies, you might get sued. Doctors use them more and more and more, and that's another huge source of increased operating costs and expenses. Finally, the drugs are too toxic, we just can't use them to protect you, and we don't know who to give them to anyway, even if we had safe drugs. The numbers of people in the workforce are declining as a percentage of total population. And in the background, we're in recession in the West, and many of us are moving into depression. So this is a model that's becoming increasingly expensive. We are less able to afford it. What cannot continue must stop. And these are the culprits, and you know how they're poisoning us. We know what's in the modern diet, and we know exactly what it's doing to us. And we know that the more of these foods, the more of them you eat, the more sick you will get, and the more that you will die. And we're at the point now where we have a great understanding of how the modern diet or the industrial diet affects us, affects our cells, affects our organs, affects our health prospects. And I won't go into a huge amount of detail here, but I'm happy to talk about it afterwards to anyone, any clinical scientist or doctor here who's interested. We know now that the modern diet really adversely affects our epigenome, that is our epigenetic code. Not our DNA, but the way in which the DNA is expressed. And it definitely damages our metabolome, which is the sum total of all the metabolic reactions that are taking place in your cells and in your body that allow you to live and to be functional. And we know now that it's doing this in certain very specific ways. Many of you have seen this slide. And the important thing is that it gives us for the first time, an opportunity to develop antidotes. And those antidotes, you're familiar with them. They were designed specifically to counter the ways in which the modern diet and lifestyle damage us. And you've seen for yourselves how effective they are. What cannot continue must stop. What cannot continue will stop. The reactive healthcare model everywhere is at the point of bankruptcy. You've seen this for yourself. Healthcare is being increasingly rationed. Hospital wards are being closed down. Personnel are just not there to take care of you, and they won't be in the coming years. No country can afford this. This is the end of the road. We have arrived. The healthcare system is running on fumes. The gas tank is empty. What cannot continue must stop. What we have with our antidotes, our very specific antidotes, is something that works. You've seen this for yourselves. They really work. We're working medical miracles. And I could see this too at that meeting with Doug and Orion 8 years ago. I knew we'd get to this point. And I can't say how happy I am to have this wonderful opportunity of working with you. Because they were just ideas then. You are the people who make it reality. I'm so grateful to you. Ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, we have reached the end of the road. But there is a future. There is a future that is more cost effective, it's kinder, it's going to change everything. This is why in every country that we are operating, and you know we've become a genuine multinational now, doctors are choosing to work alongside us. They see the effects of our pharmaconutritional formulations in their patients. Their mindset is changing. I'm just going to finish with a very short story. I'm over length. One of my papers is being published next week. I submitted a theoretical paper on cancer management, and it went to a journal, quite a good one, called the European Journal of Medical Archives. I didn't think they'd accept it. They sent it out to peer review, and about a week later I was contacted by a man called Ashar Chandra Khan, and he's the head of oncology at the Mayo Clinics, and he said to me, "Can I write the introduction to your paper?" The point is, the medical establishment is beginning to look at what we're doing. They're beginning to listen, they're beginning to take us seriously. They're beginning to understand that this is the future of medicine. This is the new landscape. And in this new landscape, Zinzino is the lead player. That's how big this is. And I want to thank you again for making this possible. Thank you.